Somewhere in the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles beneath the surface, a wreck lies in two pieces on the ocean floor. Titanic. The name still carries weight more than a century after she sank. Bow section facing one direction, stern another, the debris field between them scattered with artifacts that once furnished the most luxurious ship afloat. Chandeliers, serving platters, leather luggage, shoes without bodies, teacups that once held breakfast service for passengers who had no idea this would be their last morning. For decades, explorers have descended to photograph this graveyard. Submersibles have circled the rusting hull, their lights revealing balustrades and portholes, and the ghostly opening where the grand staircase once descended through 4 decks of polished oak and wrought iron. The wreck deteriorates a little more each year. Bacteria consume the steel. The bow collapses inward. What was once the most famous ship in the world becomes, slowly, part of the seabed itself. But Titanic was not unique. She was the second of 3 sisters, almost identical in design, built in the same shipyard by the same workers using the same blueprints. The first was Olympic. The third was Britannic. 3 ships, 3 fates. Olympic lived for 24 years and was scrapped in 1935. Titanic lasted 4 days in service before striking ice and killing over 1,500 people. Britannic never carried a single paying passenger. She was converted into a hospital ship during the First World War and sank in the Aegean Sea in 1916, struck by a mine or perhaps a torpedo, taking 30 people down with her. This is the story of 3 ships and 1 vision, the ambitious, reckless, sometimes brilliant attempt by a shipping company to build the largest moving objects ever created by human hands. It is also the story of what happened when ambition outpaced caution, when schedules mattered more than safety, and when the men who designed and financed and crewed these vessels discovered that the ocean cares nothing for reputation or profit margins or the confidence of engineers. If you enjoy deep investigations into maritime history and the human stories behind legendary disasters, please consider subscribing. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. To understand why these ships existed, you must first understand the world that demanded them. The late 19th century was an age of migration on a scale never seen before. Millions of Europeans were leaving their homelands. Irish fleeing famine and poverty, Italians seeking work, Eastern European Jews escaping persecution, Germans, Scandinavians, Poles, Greeks, all flowing westward toward America, toward Canada, toward new lives in countries they had only heard described in letters from relatives who had gone before. The numbers are staggering. Between 1880 and 1920, roughly 25 million people crossed the Atlantic to begin again. They traveled in steerage, the cheapest class, packed into dormitories deep in the hull where the air was thick and the food was basic, and the rolling of the ship made many of them ill for the entire voyage. But they came anyway. They came because the alternative was staying in places that offered no future. This human cargo made shipping companies rich. The profit margins on steerage passengers were enormous. A berth cost the company almost nothing to provide. A bunk, 3 meals a day of stew and bread, access to shared lavatories. The fares, though cheap by the standards of first class, added up quickly when you were carrying 2,000 people at a time. The arithmetic was simple. More passengers meant more profit, and more passengers required bigger ships. But the Atlantic passenger trade was also fiercely competitive. Multiple companies fought for the same routes, the same emigrants, the same wealthy travelers who would pay premium prices for luxury cabins and attentive service. Speed mattered. The blue riband, an informal honor given to the ship with the fastest Atlantic crossing, carried real commercial value. A company holding the blue ribbon could advertise that fact and attract passengers who valued their time. By 1900, the competition had intensified into something approaching an arms race. Cunard Line and White Star Line, both British, were the dominant players. Cunard had recently announced plans for two revolutionary new ships, Lusitania and Mauretania, designed to be the fastest vessels afloat. They would be powered by the new Parsons steam turbine, a technology that promised higher speeds with lower fuel consumption. They would take the blue riband and, presumably, the most valuable customers. White Star faced a choice. They could try to match Cunard for speed, an expensive and uncertain proposition. Or they could compete on a different axis entirely. They chose size. They chose luxury. They chose to build something so large and so magnificent that speed would become irrelevant, that passengers would choose White Star not because the crossing was faster, but because the experience was incomparable. The man who made this decision was J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line. Ismay had inherited the company from his father, Thomas Ismay, who had built White Star into a respectable mid-tier shipping firm. J. Bruce wanted more. He wanted White Star to be the greatest shipping company in the world, and he believed that the way to achieve this was through scale and spectacle rather than raw velocity. In 1907, Ismay dined with Lord Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that had built every White Star vessel for decades. Over that dinner, the concept took shape. 3 massive ships, each around 45,000 tons, far larger than anything afloat. They would operate a weekly express service between Southampton and New York, with one ship always at sea, one in New York, and one in Southampton. The crossing would take about a week. The ships would be so large that they could carry enough fuel and provisions for the voyage without intermediate stops. And they would be so luxurious that first-class passengers would feel they were staying at the finest hotels in Europe rather than traveling on the open ocean. The project would require unprecedented investment. Harland and Wolff would need to expand their facilities to accommodate ships of this size. New slipways would have to be built, new gantry cranes erected, new equipment ordered. The ships themselves would cost approximately £1.5 million each, the equivalent of roughly £150 million today, and the ongoing operating costs would be enormous. Fuel, crew wages, provisions, maintenance, insurance. But Ismay was not deterred. He believed that the gamble would pay off, that the combination of size and luxury would attract passengers willing to pay premium fares, that White Star would establish a new standard for Atlantic travel that competitors could not easily match. The order was placed. Construction would begin in Belfast in 1908. The world that demanded these ships was a world of confidence, of expansion, of belief in progress. The British Empire was at its height. Technology was advancing rapidly. Engineers were solving problems that had seemed insurmountable a generation before. It seemed reasonable to believe that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, that the ocean itself could be tamed by sufficient steel and power and planning. That belief would be tested and found wanting. The shipyard at Belfast that would build the Olympic-class liners occupied the eastern shore of the River Lagan, a sprawling industrial complex where the noise never stopped. Harland and Wolff had constructed ships for decades, developing techniques and institutional knowledge that made them the obvious choice for White Star's ambitious project. Lord Peary, who ran the shipyard, was personally invested in the success of the Olympic class. He served on White Star's board. The relationship between shipbuilder and shipping line was intimate, perhaps too intimate for the kind of rigorous oversight that a project of this scale required. The chief designer was Thomas Andrews, Lord Peary's nephew, a man who had joined Harland and Wolff as a teenager and worked his way up through the drafting offices and workshops until he understood every aspect of ship construction. Andrews was widely respected, not just for his technical knowledge, but for his character. He was known to walk the decks of ships under construction, talking with the workers, observing their methods, looking for problems that might not appear on blueprints. He would sail on Titanic's maiden voyage, and he would die in the sinking, reportedly last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting above the fireplace, his lifebelt lying unused on a table beside him. The design process took months. Andrews and his team worked through thousands of decisions, each one shaping the vessel that would eventually emerge from the slipway. The ships would be 882 feet long, roughly the length of 4 city blocks laid end to end. They would be 92 feet wide. Their gross tonnage would exceed 45,000 tons, making them the largest moving objects ever created by human hands. The hull would be constructed of steel plates, each one individually manufactured and then riveted into place by hand. The rivets themselves would number over 3 million per ship. Some would be steel, some iron, depending on location and the loads they would bear. The bow section, which would meet the ocean head-on and absorb the greatest stress, used hydraulically inserted steel rivets. The stern and hull sides, where access was more difficult and hydraulic equipment harder to position, often relied on hand-hammered iron rivets. This decision would later come under scrutiny. Because iron rivets have a lower shear strength than steel, and under extreme stress, they can pop from their holes like buttons from a shirt. The hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments by 15 transverse bulkheads, walls running across the width of the ship. The compartments could be sealed by closing watertight doors, controlled from the bridge. The theory was that if the hull was breached, the flooding could be contained to 1 or 2 compartments, and the ship would remain afloat. The shipbuilders calculated that the vessel could survive with any 2 compartments flooded, or the first 4 compartments flooded, or certain combinations of 3 compartments. This capability led to the famous description of the ships as practically unsinkable, a phrase that would haunt everyone associated with the project after April 1912. But the watertight compartments had a critical limitation. The bulkheads did not extend all the way to the top of the hull. They rose only to E-deck, about 10 feet above the waterline under normal conditions. If the bow dropped far enough that water rose above E-deck, it would pour over the top of the bulkheads into the next compartment, and the next, and the next, like water spilling from one ice cube tray section into another when you tilt the tray. This design flaw would prove fatal for Titanic, but it was not an oversight born of ignorance. It was a deliberate choice, made to preserve the flow of passenger circulation on the upper decks. Grand staircases and first-class lounges and promenades would have been interrupted by walls extending to the boat deck. Aesthetics and passenger convenience were weighed against safety, and aesthetics won. The power plant was equally massive. The ships would be propelled by a combination of 2 reciprocating steam engines and 1 low-pressure turbine driving 3 propellers. The reciprocating engines, each standing 4 stories tall, would power the 2 outer propellers. Exhaust steam from these engines would then be routed to a central turbine, which would power the middle propeller. This arrangement was more efficient than traditional reciprocating engines alone, extracting additional work from steam that would otherwise be wasted. The engines required 29 boilers, fired by 159 furnaces, consuming approximately 600 tons of coal per day at cruising speed. The engine rooms and boiler rooms occupied the lower decks, vast mechanical cathedrals where firemen shoveled coal in shifts around the clock, where engineers monitored gauges and adjusted valves, where the heat was constant and the noise was deafening. These spaces were designed for function, not comfort. The workers who operated them lived in a different world from the passengers above. But it was the passenger spaces that would define the Olympic class in the public imagination, and it is to those spaces that we now turn. The first-class areas of the Olympic-class liners were designed to make passengers forget they were at sea. The decorators and architects worked to create spaces that echoed the great hotels and manor houses of Europe. Rooms where wealthy travelers could feel at home rather than in transit. The scale was extraordinary, and so was the attention to detail. Begin with the grand staircase, the iconic feature that has come to symbolize these ships in the century since Titanic sank. It descended through 6 decks from the boat deck to E deck, a sweeping double staircase beneath an ornate wrought iron and glass dome that flooded the space with natural light during the day. The balustrades were polished oak, curved and carved by craftsmen who specialized in this work. At the first landing stood a carved wooden panel featuring a clock flanked by allegorical figures representing honor and glory crowning time. The panel was functional, but it was also a statement. This was a ship where time itself was meant to feel suspended, where the journey mattered as much as the destination. The grand staircase opened onto the first-class reception room on D deck, a space furnished with wicker armchairs and small tables where passengers gathered before meals, drinks in hand, surveying each other's attire. From there, doors led to the first-class dining saloon, the largest room afloat. It stretched 114 feet long and spanned the full width of the ship, capable of seating over 500 passengers at once. The walls were white-painted oak paneled in Jacobean style, with intricate carvings around the portholes. The ceiling arched above, leaded glass windows set into its panels. Passengers entered expecting the finest hotel dining rooms in London or Paris, and found something that rivaled them. Meals in first class were elaborate affairs. Breakfast might include fruits, eggs prepared in multiple styles, grilled fish, bacon, sausages, pastries, oatmeal, and coffee or tea. Dinner ran to 10 courses or more: oysters, consommé, salmon, chicken, lamb, roast duckling, sirloin of beef, pâté de foie gras, puddings, cheeses, coffee, and port. The dining room hummed with conversation and the clink of silver against china, stewards moving silently between tables, orchestral music drifting from the balcony above. But the public rooms told only part of the story. The first-class staterooms ranged from comfortable single cabins to elaborate suites that approached the luxury of apartments. The most expensive accommodation on Titanic, the parlor suite, cost over $4,000 for the crossing, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today. These suites featured private promenades, sitting rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms with full-size tubs, and servant quarters. The decor varied by suite, with options including French Renaissance, Georgian, and Louis XV styles. Passengers could choose the ambiance that suited their taste, as if selecting a room at a grand hotel. The first-class lounge occupied a prime position on A deck, furnished with silk brocade sofas and mahogany tables, the walls lined with carved panels and the ceiling featuring a painted dome. Adjacent sat the reading and writing room, deliberately designed in a quieter style, with white Georgian paneling and green upholstered furniture, a retreat for those seeking solitude amid the social whirl. Windows overlooked the boat deck and the sea beyond. The smoking room, reserved for men, presented an entirely different atmosphere. Dark mahogany paneling, stained glass windows depicting ports and ships, leather armchairs arranged around marble-top tables. After dinner, the gentlemen retired here for cigars and whiskey and cards while their wives returned to the lounge. The air would grow thick with smoke, conversation ranging from business deals to politics to gossip about other passengers. The room stayed open late, and it was here, in Titanic's smoking room, that some of the ship's final dramas would unfold. Men playing cards as the bow sank beneath the Atlantic, refusing lifeboats because they could not imagine the unsinkable truly sinking. First class also enjoyed exclusive access to a gymnasium, a novelty for 1912. It featured rowing machines, cycling machines, a mechanical horse for simulating riding, and a mechanical camel. An instructor supervised the equipment and encouraged passengers to exercise. Adjacent was the first-class swimming pool, one of the first ever installed on a ship, a heated seawater bath lined with white tiles. Turkish baths offered steam rooms, hot rooms, a temperate room, and a cooling room, with adjacent massage facilities. The squash court, located below E-deck, allowed passengers to work off elaborate meals. But the Olympic-class liners were not solely playgrounds for the wealthy. They were also working ships carrying thousands of passengers in second and third class, and the contrast between these worlds was stark. Second class occupied the stern portion of the ship, a step down from first class, but still comfortable by the standards of the day. The second-class dining saloon on D-deck seated over 300 passengers at long mahogany tables with swivel chairs. The meals were simpler than first class, but still substantial. Roast beef, boiled potatoes, vegetables, puddings. The second-class library offered books and writing materials. The second-class smoke room provided a masculine retreat, similar to its first-class equivalent, though with less elaborate decor. Third class, often called steerage, represented the economic engine that made the Olympic-class liners profitable. These passengers traveled in dormitory-style accommodations deep in the ship, in the bow and stern sections, separated from the upper classes not just by deck, but by design. White Star marketed their third-class facilities as superior to those of competitors. And in some ways, they were. Enclosed cabins rather than open dormitories, dining rooms rather than passengers eating at their bunks. But the conditions remained basic. Cabins designed for 4 sometimes held more during peak migration seasons. Bathrooms were shared among dozens of passengers. The dining saloon served straightforward meals: porridge, stew, bread, potatoes. The third-class general room, located on D-deck in the stern, served as a combined lounge and social space. Here, passengers gathered for conversation, card games, and music. Third-class passengers brought their own instruments, and impromptu concerts filled the evenings. The atmosphere was livelier than the restrained elegance of first class, communities forming among travelers who shared language, nationality, and the hope of new beginnings. But between these worlds, barriers existed. Gates and locked doors separated third class from the upper decks, ostensibly for immigration control purposes. When disaster struck, these barriers would slow escape for those below. Beyond the passenger spaces stretched the hidden infrastructure that kept the ships functioning. Service corridors ran through the hull like arteries, allowing crew to move between stations without passing through public areas. Kitchen facilities sprawled across several decks, massive operations capable of producing thousands of meals daily. Bakeries, butcheries, vegetable preparation areas, separate pantries for first, second, and third class. Cold storage rooms preserved perishables. Wine cellars held the vintages for first-class tables. Laundries processed the endless flow of linens. The crew numbered over 800. Officers, engineers, firemen, stewards, waiters, cooks, musicians, bellboys, lookouts. They worked in shifts, many living in quarters below deck where the throb of engines was constant. The firemen, who shoveled coal into the furnaces, labored in temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, emerging from their shifts coated in coal dust and sweat. Their work was essential and brutal and largely invisible to the passengers enjoying cocktails on the promenade above. This was the Olympic class. 3 floating worlds, each self-contained, each representing a different experience of the Atlantic crossing. For those in first class, the voyage was a vacation, a chance to see and be seen among the powerful and fashionable. For those in third class, it was a passage to a new life. A few uncomfortable days to be endured in exchange for whatever waited on the other side. For the crew, it was work, a paycheck, a job that demanded long hours and carried real dangers. The ships were designed to hold all of these realities at once, to satisfy all of these needs, and for a brief moment, they succeeded. The construction of the Olympic-class liners transformed Belfast. Harland and Wolff had to expand its facilities to accommodate ships of unprecedented size. 2 new slipways were built side by side, each over 800 feet long, with a massive gantry straddling them both. The Aral gantry, as it was called, rose 228 feet above the slipways, a skeleton of steel girders and cranes designed to lift materials and components into position as the hulls took shape. At night, electric lights turned the gantry into a beacon visible for miles, announcing to the city that something extraordinary was underway. Olympic's keel was laid on December 16, 1908. Titanic's keel followed 3 months later, on March 31, 1909. The 2 ships would be built simultaneously, progressing side by side, their hulls rising in parallel like twin monuments. Britannic, the third sister, would not begin construction until 1911, after Olympic had launched and Titanic was well advanced. The workforce at its peak exceeded 15,000 men. Riveters worked in teams of 4, one heating the rivet, one inserting it, 2 hammering it from opposite sides until the heads formed. A skilled team could install 200 rivets in a day. Multiply that by the 3 million rivets required per ship, and you begin to understand the scale of labor involved. The noise was extraordinary. The clanging of hammers, the hiss of steam, the shouts of foremen coordinating crews. The din started at dawn and continued until dusk, 6 days a week. The work was dangerous. Falls were common. Men slipped from scaffolding or staging and plummeted into the hull or onto the slipway below. Records suggest that at least 8 men died during Titanic's construction, though the actual number may have been higher, because record-keeping for industrial accidents was less rigorous than it would later become. 1 man was killed by a falling piece of timber. Others were crushed by moving equipment or fell from heights. These deaths were treated as occupational hazards, regrettable but unavoidable in an industry where heavy objects moved constantly and safety equipment was minimal. The workers came from across Belfast and beyond. Many were Catholics and Protestants working side by side, their sectarian divisions subordinated temporarily to the demands of the job. Wages varied by skill. A rivet heater might earn 15 shillings a week, while a skilled plater could make 3 times that. The money was decent by the standards of the day, enough to support a family, but the conditions were hard. Winter meant working in rain and cold, fingers numb on metal tools. Summer brought heat that made the riveting stations unbearable. As the hulls rose, systems were installed. Steel plates were lifted into position by the gantry cranes and held while riveters secured them. The watertight bulkheads went in. The engine beds were constructed. The propeller shafts were aligned. Each stage required coordination among different trades: platers, riveters, fitters, electricians, plumbers. Thomas Andrews walked the construction site regularly, observing progress, identifying problems, pushing for solutions. He knew the ships intimately, every deck, every compartment, every system. By late 1910, Olympic was ready for launch. On October 20th, the gantry fell silent. Crowds gathered along the riverbank and in specially constructed grandstands. 20 tons of tallow and soap had been applied to the slipway to ease the hull's passage into the water. At a signal, the restraining triggers were released, and Olympic began to slide. She gathered speed, striking the water with a wave that surged toward the opposite bank. 62 seconds after release, she floated free, the largest moving object ever constructed by humanity. Fitting out began immediately. Olympic was towed to a deep-water wharf where the engines, boilers, and interior spaces would be installed. The work continued through the winter and into the following spring. Titanic's launch followed on May 31st, 1911, before an even larger crowd. The two sisters now floated side by side as final work proceeded. Olympic entered service on June 14, 1911, departing Southampton for New York on her maiden voyage. She arrived to enthusiastic press coverage, journalists praising her size, her luxury, her stability in the crossing. The venture seemed to be succeeding. White Star had a flagship that exceeded expectations, and Titanic would follow within a year. But problems emerged almost immediately. On September 20th, 1911, Olympic collided with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke while leaving Southampton. The cruiser's reinforced bow punched a hole in Olympic's starboard side, flooding two watertight compartments. The ship limped back to port and required extensive repairs. The collision raised questions about Olympic's maneuverability, her turning radius, the decisions made by her captain. These questions would echo again 7 months later. The repairs delayed Olympic's return to service and, more critically, diverted workers and materials from Titanic's fitting out. Some historians have suggested that the rush to get Titanic ready for her April 10th, 1912 maiden voyage led to shortcuts, to inspections that were hurried, to problems that were noted but not corrected. How much truth lies in these suggestions remains debated. What is certain is that Titanic departed Southampton with several small coal fires smoldering in her bunkers, fires that the crew had been managing for days without fully extinguishing. Whether these fires weakened the hull near the point of impact with the iceberg is another question historians continue to debate. The ships were built, the investments were made, the maiden voyages approached, and in boardrooms and engine rooms and stewards' quarters, people prepared for what was supposed to be the future of Atlantic travel. No one prepared for what actually came. RMS Olympic entered regular service in June 1911, inaugurating what White Star hoped would be a new era of Atlantic travel. The ship's first season exceeded expectations. Wealthy passengers booked the suites, immigrants filled steerage. The press covered arrivals and departures with the attention usually reserved for society weddings and political scandals. Olympic became a destination in herself, a floating palace where the famous and powerful mingled, and where those seeking fame and power hoped to be noticed. The passenger lists read like directories of Edwardian elites. Industrialists crossed to oversee American investments. Aristocrats traveled for amusement or to escape scandals brewing at home. Actresses and opera singers booked suites between engagements. The new rich of both continents sought legitimacy by associating with the old rich, and Olympic's first-class lounges provided the stage. Dinner tables buzzed with multiple languages, the commerce of a globalizing world conducted between courses. For those in third class, the experience was different but no less significant. Emigrants brought trunks containing everything they owned: clothing, photographs, letters, the few valuables that could be carried. They left behind villages, families, languages, entire lives. The crossing represented a break so profound that many never returned. The ships carried this human cargo westward by the thousands, feeding the factories and farms of an expanding America. Olympic developed a reputation for reliability and comfort. Captain Edward Smith, White Star's most senior and trusted commander, took the helm for her maiden voyage and remained in command through the first season. Smith was 62 years old, an experienced master with decades of service. His calm demeanor and distinguished appearance reassured passengers. He would later be assigned to command Titanic. and he would die in her sinking, his final moments the subject of conflicting accounts. The crossing took approximately 5 days depending on weather and sea conditions. Passengers settled into routines. Breakfast at 8, followed by walks on the promenade or reading in the library. Bouillon served at 11, luncheon at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 7, a formal affair requiring appropriate dress. After dinner, music and cards and conversation until passengers retired to their cabins. The days blurred together, suspended between two continents, the ship, a self-contained world. Titanic's maiden voyage was scheduled for April 10, 1912. The ship had completed her sea trials the day before, a brief testing period that lasted approximately 8 hours. In that time, the crew ran the engines at various speeds, tested the steering, and conducted emergency drills, including a crash stop. She passed these tests and received her certificate of seaworthiness. Some observers later questioned whether the trials had been thorough enough, whether more time should have been spent evaluating a new vessel of this unprecedented size. The passenger list for the maiden voyage included some of the wealthiest people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, heir to the Astor fortune, traveled with his young second wife, who was pregnant with their first child. Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate and member of one of America's most prominent families, had booked a suite. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveled with his wife Ida. Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, was returning to Denver after visiting her grandchild in Paris. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star Line, occupied a suite on B deck. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, was aboard to observe the new vessel in service and note any needed modifications. The two men represented different aspects of the venture. Ismay the commercial imperatives, Andrews the engineering reality. Both would survive the night of the sinking, though Andrews chose not to. The ship departed Southampton on schedule, stopping at Cherbourg to collect passengers who had arrived by tender, then at Queenstown in Ireland for additional embarking and mail. By Thursday evening, April 11th, Titanic was steaming west into the Atlantic, carrying approximately 2,224 passengers and crew. The first 3 days passed uneventfully. The sea was calm, the weather clear and cold. Passengers explored the ship, settled into the rhythms of the crossing, began forming the casual acquaintances that shipboard life encourages. The ship maintained a steady speed of around 21 knots, slightly below her maximum capability. Everything functioned as designed, but the wireless operators were receiving ice warnings from other ships. The Rappahannock had reported heavy field ice. The Nordam had seen ice. The Caronia, the Baltic, the America all transmitted warnings of ice ahead. These messages were logged, and some were delivered to the bridge. Others apparently were not, or were set aside, or were given to Ismay rather than to the captain. The practice of the era did not emphasize ice avoidance the way later generations would. Ships routinely sailed through ice fields, adjusting course only when necessary. Speed was rarely reduced. The prevailing belief was that lookouts could spot ice in time to steer clear, that modern ships could take glancing blows without serious damage, that the Atlantic was vast enough that collisions were statistically improbable. This confidence would not survive the night of April 14, 1912. The evening of April 14, 1912, was clear and cold. The temperature had dropped steadily through the day, and by nightfall, the sea surface approached freezing. There was no moon. The stars burned with unusual clarity in the darkness, but the sea itself lay flat and black, without the white wave crests that might have revealed ice against the water. The first-class passengers finished dinner and dispersed to their usual evening occupations. Some retired to the smoking room for cards. Others gathered in the lounge to hear the orchestra. Many returned to their cabins, preparing for sleep. The ship held its usual night watch, lookouts in the crow's nest scanning the darkness ahead, officers on the bridge monitoring course and speed. At 11:39 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead, a darker shape against the darkness. He rang the bell 3 times, the signal for object ahead, and telephoned the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered hard to starboard, attempting to swing the bow away from the obstacle. He also ordered the engine stopped and then reversed. For approximately 30 seconds, the ship's momentum continued carrying her forward as the helm took effect. The bow began to swing to port. It was not enough. At 11:40 p.m., the starboard side of the bow scraped along the iceberg, which passed so close that chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck. Passengers below reported a grinding vibration, a shudder that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then, silence. The damage was invisible from the deck. The collision had buckled plates and popped rivets along a stretch of the hull below the waterline, opening seams that allowed the Atlantic to pour into the ship. The first 6 compartments were breached. Water entered the forepeak, the forward cargo hold, the lower postal room, the squash court, boiler room 6. The pumps could not keep pace. The bow began to settle. Thomas Andrews was summoned to assess the damage. He descended into the flooding compartments, measuring the rate at which the water was rising, calculating how the weight would shift as compartments filled. His conclusion was immediate and final. The ship would sink. The mathematics allowed no other outcome. With 6 compartments open to the sea, the bow would drop until water poured over the tops of the watertight bulkheads into the compartments beyond, each flooding compartment pulling the bow lower, accelerating the process until the ship broke apart or went under. Andrews estimated they had perhaps an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and swung out. Wireless operators began transmitting the distress call, the new CQD signal followed by their position. Other ships responded. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, turned toward Titanic at maximum speed. The Frankfurt, the Mount Temple, the Baltic all acknowledged an altered course. But the distances were vast. The Carpathia would not arrive for 4 hours. The ship had lifeboat capacity for approximately 1,178 people. She was carrying over 2,200 passengers and crew. The arithmetic was brutal and could not be escaped. The evacuation began slowly, too slowly. Many passengers did not believe the ship was in danger. The list was slight. The deck still felt solid underfoot, and the idea that this massive vessel could sink seemed preposterous. When crew began loading lifeboats, many passengers refused to board. Why trade the warmth and safety of the ship for a small wooden boat on the freezing Atlantic? The boats went away half empty. Lifeboat 7, designed for 65 people, carried 28. Lifeboat 1, an emergency cutter with capacity for 40, held only 12 passengers and crew. As the night progressed and the bow sank lower, panic finally spread. But by then, many boats had already launched. The stories from that night are many, and each one carries weight. Benjamin Guggenheim, told there was no chance, retired to his cabin with his valet. Both men changed into evening dress. "We have dressed in our best," Guggenheim reportedly said, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Isidore and Ida Strauss were offered places in a lifeboat. Ida refused to leave her husband. They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the water rose. In third class, the situation was worse. The compartmentalization of the ship meant that steerage passengers had to navigate unfamiliar corridors to reach the boat deck. Gates that had separated classes during the voyage remained locked longer than they should have been. Many third-class passengers did not speak English and could not understand the crew's instructions. By the time some of them reached the upper decks, the boats were gone. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the ship's lights flickered and went out. The bow had sunk so far that the stern rose clear of the water, propellers exposed. The stress on the hull exceeded its structural limits. The ship broke apart between the third and fourth funnels, the stern section briefly righting itself before following the bow to the bottom. The noise, survivors later reported, was beyond description. The crash of everything not bolted down sliding forward, the scream of steel tearing, the roar of water. At 2:20 a.m., Titanic was gone. In the water, over 1,500 people struggled in freezing temperatures that would kill most of them within 30 minutes. The lifeboats, many still carrying empty seats, rowed away from the suction they feared would drag them under. Only one boat returned to pick up swimmers. It found 4 people still alive. The Carpathia arrived at 4 a.m. and began recovering survivors. The sun rose on an ocean scattered with wreckage and bodies. The rescue continued until all lifeboats had been found. The final count, 710 survivors out of more than 2,200 aboard. The ship that could not sink had sunk on her maiden voyage. The ship designed to demonstrate human mastery of the Atlantic had been humbled in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The ocean had answered, and its answer was cold. The world learned of the disaster gradually. Early reports, based on fragmentary wireless transmissions, suggested that Titanic had struck ice but remained afloat, that all passengers were being transferred to rescue vessels. For hours, newspapers printed reassuring headlines. Then the truth emerged, and the shock was profound. Titanic had become a symbol of modern achievement before she even sailed. Her sinking forced a confrontation with the limits of that achievement. If a ship this large, this celebrated, this carefully engineered could founder on her maiden voyage, what did that say about the confident Edwardian assumption that technology had conquered nature? The inquiries began immediately. The United States Senate convened hearings within days of the survivors' arrival in New York. British Board of Trade hearings followed in London. Both sought the same answers. What had happened? Who was responsible? What should be done to prevent recurrence? The testimonies revealed a pattern of casual decisions that had accumulated into catastrophe. The ship had been traveling too fast through an ice field. The lookouts had no binoculars. The wireless operators had been overwhelmed with passenger messages and had not prioritized ice warnings. The lifeboats had been lowered before passengers understood the danger. Third-class passengers had faced barriers reaching the boat deck. The Californian, a ship that may have been close enough to rescue everyone, had apparently seen distress rockets, but failed to respond. J. Bruce Ismay bore particular criticism. He had survived while over 1,500 others died, and the question of whether the chairman of the line deserved a lifeboat seat when women and children went down with the ship became a subject of intense public debate. Ismay claimed he had helped load boats and stepped into one only when it was about to lower with empty seats. Critics called him a coward who had prioritized his own survival over his responsibilities. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian faced equally harsh scrutiny. His ship had stopped for the night, surrounded by ice, approximately 10 to 20 miles from Titanic's position. His crew had observed rockets in the sky, but interpreted them as company signals rather than distress calls. Lord went to bed. The Californian did not move toward the rockets. Whether she could have reached Titanic in time to save lives remains disputed. But Lord's failure to investigate became a permanent stain on his reputation. The inquiries produced recommendations that transformed maritime safety. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914, established new requirements for lifeboat capacity, requiring enough boats for everyone aboard. It mandated continuous wireless watch so that distress calls would never again go unheard. It created the International Ice Patrol, tasked with monitoring iceberg movement in the North Atlantic and warning ships of danger. The regulations also addressed the design flaws that the sinking had revealed. Future ships would be required to have watertight bulkheads extending higher, to the waterline at minimum. Double hulls would become standard. Fire and safety drills would be required. White Star Line survived, but the Titanic disaster marked the beginning of its long decline. The company's reputation never fully recovered. When Olympic returned to service after modifications prompted by the sinking, she sailed with more lifeboats and under captains who took ice warnings seriously. But the confidence was gone. The romance of Atlantic travel had been punctured by the reality of 1,500 bodies in the freezing water. Thomas Andrews had died as he lived, thinking of the ship. Survivors reported seeing him in the first-class smoking room near the end, staring at a painting of Plymouth Harbor, making no move toward the lifeboats. He had built the ship. He knew better than anyone what the flooding meant. Perhaps he could not face surviving when his creation took so many down. Olympic endured. She returned to service after the disaster, modified with additional lifeboats and a reinforced hull that extended her double bottom higher along the sides. Passengers still booked passage, though the atmosphere had changed. The earlier insouciance about Atlantic travel, the assumption that these massive vessels were inherently safe, had died with Titanic. When war came in 1914, Olympic initially continued commercial service, but the risks from German submarines soon made this untenable. In 1915, she was requisitioned for transport duty, carrying troops to Gallipoli and later to France. Her size made her valuable. She could carry thousands of soldiers per voyage. Her speed made her difficult for submarines to target. On May 12, 1918, Olympic had her most dramatic wartime encounter. While carrying American troops to France, she spotted a German U-boat on the surface. Rather than evade, Olympic's captain ordered full speed toward the submarine. The liner rammed U-103, cutting through her pressure hull and sending her to the bottom. Olympic became one of the few merchant vessels to sink an enemy warship, a distinction that gave her crew considerable pride. After the war, Olympic resumed commercial service. She received upgrades and refits, her appearance evolving with changing fashions. Oil-fired boilers replaced coal, reducing crew requirements and improving efficiency. First-class interiors were modernized, though the essential character remained. She carried passengers through the 1920s, a period of transatlantic prosperity when the rich crossed in style and immigration continued to fill steerage. But time and economics caught up with her. The Great Depression crushed passenger traffic. New ships with more modern designs entered service. Olympic, despite her history, had become dated. In 1935, White Star Line merged with Cunard, and Olympic was deemed surplus. She was sold for scrap and broken up at Jarrow. Her fixtures auctioned to buyers who installed Titanic-era woodwork in pubs and private homes around Britain. Some of Olympic's fittings survive. The first-class lounge paneling was installed in a paint factory's boardroom. Light fixtures turned up in private collections. Her whistles were preserved and occasionally sounded at memorials. The physical remnants scattered, but they connected the present to those vanished floating palaces. Britannic's fate was briefer and stranger. The third Olympic-class liner was launched in February 1914, but war halted her fitting out. The luxury interiors that had been planned were never installed. Instead, the ship was converted into a hospital ship, painted white with red crosses. Designated HMHS Britannic, she entered service in late 1915, carrying wounded soldiers from the Mediterranean theater back to Britain. The work was grim but essential. Each voyage brought thousands of casualties home for treatment. The ship's vast spaces, designed for luxury, now held hospital beds and operating theaters. On November 21, 1916, Britannic was steaming through the Key Channel in the Aegean Sea, bound for Mudros to collect wounded. At 8:12 a.m., an explosion tore through her forward hull. The cause remains debated. A mine or a torpedo, the evidence inconclusive after a century. Unlike Titanic, Britannic sank quickly in approximately 55 minutes. But unlike Titanic, the loss of life was small, 30 of the more than 1,000 aboard. The difference came from multiple factors. It was daylight. The water was warmer. The crew was experienced and well-drilled. Lifeboats were launched efficiently, and the captain ran the ship toward the nearby shore, hoping to beach her before she foundered. The beaching attempt failed, and Britannic sank in about 400 feet of water. But most of those aboard survived. The 30 who died were largely killed by propellers, which continued turning as the stern rose and drew in lifeboats that had launched prematurely. Britannic lies today in the Aegean, the largest passenger ship on the seabed. Her wreck is accessible to divers, unlike Titanic's in the crushing depths of the North Atlantic. Expeditions have documented her hull, her fittings, the damage from the initial explosion. She remains a wartime casualty, her service as a vessel of mercy cut short by the same war she served. Of the three sisters, only Titanic became legend. Olympic lived longest, but faded into obscurity. Britannic barely completed before being transformed into something her designers never intended. The three ships represented three possible fates: destruction by nature, gradual obsolescence, destruction by war. None achieved what their builders imagined, the decades of profitable service that were supposed to justify their enormous cost. The numbers deserve enumeration, not because statistics capture tragedy, but because without them, the scale becomes abstract. Titanic's dead numbered over 1,500. The exact figure remains uncertain, because passenger and crew manifests contained errors, because some people boarded under false names, because bodies recovered at sea could not all be identified. Of the roughly 2,100 aboard, approximately 710 survived. The mortality varied dramatically by class and by sex. Among first-class women, 97% survived. Among third-class women, 49% survived. Among first-class men, 33% survived. Among third-class men, 16% survived. The principle of women and children first was enforced, but its enforcement differed dramatically depending on where you slept. Among the crew, the firemen and engineers who kept the ship running until the end died in terrible proportions. The men who shoveled coal and manned the pumps and stayed at their posts as the water rose went down with the ship. The musicians who played on deck as the lifeboats launched, famously continuing until the end, all perished. The recovered bodies, 328 in all, were buried at sea or brought to Halifax for identification and interment. Many were never claimed. A cemetery in Halifax holds over 150 Titanic victims. Their headstones lined up in rows, some with names, some marked only unknown. The survivors carried the night with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke about it constantly, becoming professional witnesses to the disaster. Others never mentioned it, the memory too painful to revisit. Children who had been aboard grew into adults who remembered the cold, the darkness, the screams that eventually stopped. The last survivor, Milvina Dean, died in 2009 at age 97. She had been 2 months old on the night of the sinking, too young to remember anything, but the disaster defined her nonetheless. The legacy extended beyond the dead and the survivors. The sinking prompted the safety reforms already mentioned, regulations that have saved countless lives in the century since. The International Ice Patrol has monitored Atlantic icebergs continuously since 1914. The requirement for lifeboat capacity to match passenger numbers became standard. The mandate for continuous wireless watch prevented future ships from missing distress calls. But the deeper legacy was psychological. The sinking of Titanic marked a turning point in cultural confidence, a moment when the assumptions of the Edwardian age collided with reality. The ship had been described as virtually unsinkable. She sank. The ship represented the triumph of engineering. Engineering failed. The ship embodied the certainty that technology had mastered nature. Nature proved indifferent to human certainty. 2 years after Titanic sank, the Great War began. The connection is not causal, but it is thematic. The same confidence that built unsinkable ships also sent armies marching into machine guns, believing that courage and discipline could overcome industrial killing. The same faith in progress that promised transatlantic luxury also promised a short, victorious war. Both promises proved catastrophic. The wreck was located in 1985, 2.5 miles beneath the surface. Robert Ballard's expedition found her broken in two, the bow section relatively intact, the stern a debris field. Expeditions since have explored, photographed, and controversially salvaged artifacts from the site. The bow continues to deteriorate, rust formations called rusticles consuming the steel at increasing rates. Within decades, the wreck may collapse entirely, the recognizable structure becoming an unrecognizable mound on the ocean floor. Titanic has been memorialized in films, books, museums, and documentaries without number. The 1997 James Cameron film became one of the highest-grossing movies in history, introducing the disaster to generations born long after the last survivors died. The ship has become a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, invoked whenever human ambition overreaches or disaster punctures pretension. And yet the memorials risk obscuring what was lost. Each of those 1,500 dead was an individual with a name, a history, hopes, fears, people who loved them and would mourn them. The third-class emigrants who drowned in the darkness were not statistics. They were people seeking new lives who found cold deaths instead. The firemen who stayed at their posts were not abstractions. They were workers who had families and plans and who burned coal until the water took them. The ship sank because of decisions, and decisions are made by people. The choice to travel fast through ice, the choice to provide insufficient lifeboats, the choice to lock gates between classes, the choice not to return for swimmers. These were human choices made by individuals who could have chosen otherwise. Remembering the disaster means remembering those choices, understanding how reasonable people made decisions that killed 1,500 of their fellow human beings. The ocean cared nothing for intentions. It did what water does when you open a hole in a hull. The disaster was human, and the responsibility was human, and the memory must remain human if it is to mean anything at all. The Olympic-class liners were built at the apex of an era. The last years before war shattered the confident world that produced them. They represented everything that era believed about itself, that technology could overcome nature, that scale ensured success, that luxury was an achievement rather than a distraction. They were monuments to industrial capitalism, to the British Empire, to the class system that separated first class from steerage by locked gates and incompatible destinies. But they were also simply ships, doing what ships have always done, carrying people across water. The immigrants in steerage were chasing the same dreams that had driven Atlantic crossings for centuries, the hope of a better life somewhere else. The wealthy in first class were doing what the wealthy have always done, enjoying the privileges their money bought while remaining insulated from the labor that produced those privileges. The crew were workers, earning wages, doing jobs, trying to get home to families who depended on their paychecks. What sank with Titanic was not just a ship, but a certainty. The belief that modernity had solved the old problems, that science and engineering had made the world predictable, that human beings had become masters of their environment. The Atlantic reminded everyone that the environment has no masters, that nature does not negotiate, that the physics of water and ice and steel do not bend to human expectations. Olympic survived because luck placed her elsewhere on the nights that ice was in her path. Britannic died to a war that had nothing to do with the dreams of her designers. Titanic became the symbol, the one that entered permanent memory, because her death was so theatrical, so complete, so clearly a judgment on the hubris that built her. Today, the wreck lies in darkness, 2.5 miles down, deteriorating slowly as bacteria consume the steel. The bow section still shows the clean lines of Harland and Wolff's design, the portholes still visible, the deck railings still tracing the shape of the ship. In a few decades, the structure may collapse entirely, the recognizable vessel becoming just another mound on the abyssal plain. But the memory will persist. Titanic has become a permanent part of the human story, a parable about ambition and limits, a reminder that the things we build can fail and the people we trust can be wrong. And the universe does not care about our schedules or our reputations or our plans. The three sisters were supposed to conquer the Atlantic. Instead, the Atlantic conquered two of them, and time conquered the third. What remains is the story, the 1,500 dead, the lessons that cost lives to learn, and the endless fascination with a night when the unsinkable sank and the world that believed it could not happen was forced to believe otherwise. The shipyard at Belfast is quiet now. The gantries are gone. The slipways that launched the largest ships of their age have become museums and memorials. Tourists walk where workers once riveted plates, where hulls rose course by course toward launch, where the dreams of J. Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews took physical form in steel and oak and brass. The Atlantic continues as it always has, cold and deep and indifferent. Ships still cross it, faster and safer than Olympic or Titanic ever were. The International Ice Patrol still monitors icebergs, the legacy of that April night still protecting mariners a century later. And somewhere on the ocean floor, the wreck endures for now, a rusting monument to everything human beings believed they could achieve and everything they failed to foresee. This was the story of three ships. This was the story of the world that built them. And this was the story of the night that world ended.